Welcome, Pramod Nayar from the University of Hyderabad, India. I'm so honored to have you with me today, Pramod.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about, you are, I think, one of the most prolific scholars I know, or one of several, but my gosh, you publish at least a book a year, sometimes more. And what I'm really kind of curious about is the whole vision, of course, your whole approach. You work on postcolonial, you work on this consumer culture, cultural studies, you do books on extreme contemporary culture. But tell us about comic studies, Pramod, and how you got into this.
Well, Frederick, just as you mentioned, it's one of several interests. People will say, those who don't like me say I have too many. People who like me say it's too few. So comics is one of several things. I got into comic studies fairly late, I would think, though comics, in terms of my reading, has been a very old fascination. I've read comics from childhood. Like many people of my class upbringing, English educated, I read the comic books, Amar Chitrakatha, Chandamama, the Commando comics, all those Mandrake, Phantom, Flash Gordon, Indrajal comic from Indrajal Comics stable. The classics illustrated, that's how I first got introduced to Valentine and the big adventure tradition. They came in the form of the classics illustrated. For people who, like I said, of a certain class, it was part of what we have been brought up on. I did do an early chapter on Amashtarakatha comics in a book, Reading Culture, that was, I think, 2003 or 2004, not exactly sure. More like a trial run. Sustained academic work on comics came fairly late, about 2011 or so, 2012. Then I published on superhero comics, which was one of the largest genres that I have been brought up on. Somebody needs to switch their audio off, please. I'm getting background noise. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I wasn't very systematic in pursuing a specific genre or line of inquiry through comics, I must say. The superhero genre recommended itself because that was a genre, one of the genres I grew up with. And though I read texts like Mouse, I had not thought about working on them very seriously. But then I was a whole bunch of other non-fictional graphic novels. And that was a genre within a genre. A well-loved medium like comics introduced me to a subgenre like the non-fictional text, Mouse being one of the earliest. So I could see a turn from comics becoming grittier, moving from fictional superheroes to concentration camps, from the fantasy to gritty socialism, social realism. And in 2012, I think, I published an essay on Bhimayana in studies in South Asian film and media. But I was still not thinking in terms of a book. Scattered essays appeared on Frank Miller's Ronin, The Dark Knight Returns, and things. But Bhimayana was the first Indian graphic novel I worked seriously with. And around 2015, I worked with other things, like you said, consumer culture, written stuff on culture studies and things like that. I thought of a full-length book around that time. I was working on a book on human rights and literature, incidentally, and I was reading a lot of graphic novels about war and genocide and atrocity. That's how the book actually happened. I have read stuff from outside India and published work on Mouse, Incognito, the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks, on Trinity, the text on the atom bomb, on the Manhattan Project, and things like that. And among the Indian graphic novels, I have, in another panel, so to speak, I work consistently on essays, averaging about an essay a year. One text has been this side, that side, Vishwajyoti Ghosh, Jelly Calm, A Garden in the Wasteland, on which I published 2 essays in South Asian Review and one more recently in English language notes on Finding My Way, which appeared in Narrative and things like that. Some comparative studies I did Poche Anderson's King and Bhimayana, the Mandela and Gandhi biographies. And more recently, I think just a couple of months ago, one's been done on Thingschak's amazing minimalist text, undocumented, on refugees. So you could say that I converted a reading habit, many would say a bad habit, into an academic inquiry. And my current project is a full-length book on the human rights graphic novel. So it's not been a very systematic progression, but there is progress, you might say.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you for sharing that, the journey. Also, the Classics Illustrated, and the sort of significance of that in your kind of, early reading, and, how the classics kind of come to us, and sometimes in not the ways that, we think of in the traditional ways, and then through superheroes and into these other sort of more socio-politically minded comics. Tell us, and you're continuing this work. I love it. What for you is kind of exciting about the Indian graphic novel or comics in India, from your book to the work that you're doing today?
Well, I think one of the central concerns for me is to see how the form develops along various lines. And I think the earlier novels in Indian writing in English, the social realist tradition, has had something to do with the kind of themes that the Indian graphic novel is interested in addressing: questions of caste-based oppression, child abuse, the partition of India. So themes from history that come in this demotic form. Political issues, caste, I just mentioned, the draconian national emergency of 1975, middle class life, all of it. So I think what we have got is a demotic form for the English-speaking readers. And of course, those who can afford comics from publishers like Drawn and Quarterly, very expensive in India, they create a certain kind of readership. So I think this is an interesting moment for us. They constitute, I would think, a very important cultural text that describe, critique, analyze, and subvert social codes, questions, social inequities, historical memory, and things like that. What's exciting about them is the multimodal literacy which they force you to develop. The drawing, the way the paratexts operate. For instance, Vishwajyoti Ghosh's Delhi Calm is particularly interesting in the way slogan state notices that signify oppression and it's a legitimized monopoly over violence gets into the frame of your reading. And the position, the location of subalterns in history and subalterns in panels being arranged in certain ways. That's one. The other is when the Navayana publishers created Bhimayana and Finding My Way using Gond art in preference to the traditional panel gutter arrangement of sequential art forms. It did something very interesting and very challenging. It brought non-European forms into a global medium. Ethnic art became suddenly ultra chic, so to speak. But it also disrupted the global forms mandate. It more or less vernacularized that form. And I think that that was a very interesting and important experiment in what they were trying to do. I would also think that texts like Finding My Way and Bhimayana repurposed the visual medium to discuss things like caste and caste-based oppression. So that's a very important development. The other one would be that when they made Ambedkar's autobiographical notes into Bhimayana and the work and the autobiography of artists into a graphic novel form, it did something about the idea of the memoir itself. And I'm working here with the memoir theorist Thomas Kauser's formulation where memoirs and autobiographies are always written by somebody, within quotes, somebody. But here, as Kauser would say, are autobiographies by nobodies. It's a nobody memoir. They are actually nobodies. moving beyond political figures, stars. It foregrounded the life of an artist. So I think those kinds of shifts become very crucial to talk about the middle class, the competitiveness. Sarnath Banerjee does that in his texts. The way history has been redrawn, repurposed, retrofitted in some cases. So I think the intrusion of the medium into the visual spaces marks the creation of a very different kind of public sphere as well. So in terms of expanded cultural spaces, even if we are not actively participating, when we listen and when we read, you still participate in the making of a renovated public sphere. By renovated public sphere, I'm thinking of the power of a text like Bhimayana, and it is now a text that is taught across university syllabi in the country and abroad, I am told. Finally, I would think artists like Arijit Sen, who are visual artists and who drew graphic novels. Arijit Sen did actually the first graphic novel in India, are also public arts artists. And a lot of Arijit Sen's public art murals, for instance, are part of the new forms of public sphere interactions, public sphere engagements that emerge. So I think in terms of the expansion of cultural and civic space via this medium, it's a very exciting time.
Pramod, this is very exciting, and I'm so honored that you are bringing this knowledge to my world, something that I really don't know a lot about, to be honest. But let me ask you, how are the readers coming to these graphic novels, to these multimodal stories? How are they getting? Is it through internet? Is it through physical copies?
There are physical copies available. The Indian texts are available fairly easily via usual physical bookshops and Amazon and things like that. Libraries have begun to stock these as well. They're still expensive, I must say that. They're still expensive as compared to other texts. Primarily, I suppose, because the production costs are high. I don't know. I don't know the cultural production end of things. I'm not very aware of. I have not researched that. People did that for Indian comics, like Kathy McLean's book on the Amar Chitra Katha was done also with a lot of interviews with the artists, with the publishers, the printers, the people who drew it, the people who wrote the script and things like that. That's not that part. The ethnography of the book and its circulation is something I'm not interested in or competent to explore. So the books are increasingly available. As for the readership, they are, I think, still restricted to the English-speaking audience in India, which is a small percentage of the population. But what has to be understood is there's a huge vernacular language comic book tradition also in the country. Hindi, Raj Comics, for instance, is one of the largest publishers of comics in the Hindi language. But that's again an area I have very little, practically no expertise in. But so comics have been a part of the tradition in India. The graphic novel, more recently, a more expensive medium, but still available and expanding. In terms of readership, the other thing I noticed is in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, there are more PhDs being done on the graphic novel than I have met in the last 10 years or so. So I have discovered people working on Joe Sacco and comics journalism, and I get queries and requests from various universities. I will not comment on the quality of the work being produced. So we'll leave that aside. That's a debate of an entirely different kind. But yeah, there's a lot of work being done. So I think the readership is expanding.
Really fascinating that there's this not just explosion, but say a deep interest, and that you have, like here, I would say, a very parallel kind of experience with graduate students who have, are writing dissertations now on graphic novels, on comics, not just chapters, but actual dissertations. Yeah, so one of the things that you work on quite a bit is not just kind of expansions of cultural spaces, but expansions within systems of surveillance. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
In terms of the graphic novels, they have not addressed this question as much as it ought to be, except one text, the one I mentioned, Vishwajyoti Ghosh's Delhi Calm, which thematizes surveillance itself. So it's not being subject to that level of scrutiny within this particular medium. There are some texts from the stable of George Mathan, who he does his work under the pen name of Apupan. And some of his work, which you see in the series that he calls the Halala series, he has the theme of surveillance woven into whatever he's doing, especially the surveillance by the states, by law enforcement authorities, the kind of moral policing that is done by very postmodern consumer culture as to what you eat, what you drink, the monitoring of it. So as a theme, you see it only in very scattered forms.
As something, comics, graphic novels in India by creators there, as then in and of itself a kind of resistant narrative, possibly a way of expanding when there's a tightening and increase in surveillance. Would you agree with that, or is that too simple? Yeah.
No, it hasn't happened yet. You're thinking more in terms of the underground comics movement kind of version, or a subculture. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's what I was.
No, we haven't got that going yet. There is not really an underground. I'm sure it happens in the form of memes being circulated on private networks, but I'm not aware of it.
Very interesting. Yeah. So let me ask you, Pramod, you know, in all of the many books and all of the research that you do, you also have written on the concept of posthumanism. And tell me, are you seeing any connections with your work in comics, your interest in culture, pop culture in India?
My interest in what? I missed the last part.
In the posthumanism and popular cultural.
Oh, popular culture. Yeah. Right. Well, yes. I would think the superhero genre fits right into the posthuman temper and temperament. And if you have been brought up as I have been on the superhero genre, and the superhero is not only Western, we have had stories about superheroes in Indian traditions as well, gods, demons, and other things. There have been posthuman figures before. So we didn't have a term for it, but it has been as a kind of transformational and aspirational metaphor that has occurred across our readings. So whether it is the militarized body assemblage of Captain America, built via technology and pharmacology, or I think it represents a kind of the myth or the illusion of a perfectible human form, and is therefore an aspirational model. And posthumanism does offer you that as a popular culture version of it. Effectively, in many cases, it's a kind of techno-pharmaco-masculinity in most cases. There are exceptions. And there have been posthuman figures before, mostly the superhero variety, like I said. But also, if you think of Asterix, which gives you superhuman figures, superhero figures. So I'm thinking of what Scott Jeffrey would think of as superhumanism, which kind of subsumes posthuman and transhuman into itself. And variations on that theme. For example, it's not just the techno-human. We should also be considering characters like the Swamp Thing, which ought to get more attention than it does, than the human-animal hybrids like the X-Men. So the visions of the posthuman have changed. And for me, what's interesting is the critical philosophical posthumanist strand and the pop cultural strand, which merge in films and popular culture forms like comics, but are central to how we think of the posthuman itself. So for instance, I was thinking of this interesting book, Paul Zer's Becoming Batman, which documents how body training, the martial arts, and nutrition make Batman what he is, to show how a superhuman can be broken down into bits. So I would think in terms of popular culture, I would go with Cicerone's suggestion that about science fiction, that posthumanism in popular culture is a mode of awareness. I'm borrowing that phrase from Cicerone's description of science fiction. A mode of awareness. It incorporates some amount of scientific knowledge, a lot of scientific speculation. It has philosophy, wild imagination, and cultural theory, looking at the future generation. So I think of posthumanism in pop culture as generating a mode of awareness. For instance, in Apupan's new work, Snake and the Lotus, it's a posthumanist vision, but merges it with an environmental consciousness. It shows the green with the capital G has been destroyed, the earth has been taken over, we are all slaves to machinery, and there's an ecological return of the repressed. But towards the end, it gives you a posthumanist vision of a return to a sacred world, which is a bit of a romanticization, but like I said, it's a speculative thing, and in which many life forms coexist. And here, Apupan concludes with his protagonist, who sees the interconnectedness of all life forms, the ant, the whale, the locust, the human. It's a very posthumanist vision. So I think of it, which is why I said as a mode of awareness, it's looking at an awareness of the interconnectedness of life forms, the co-evolution of species. And popular culture has an enormous role to play in the transformational vision, which is posthumanism. So I think the comic book version, the graphic novel version, is central to how posthumanism is likely to evolve and become integrated into a social imaginary.
Wow, beautiful, beautifully articulated, Pramod. Thank you. This kind of leads us into your work on eco-precarity and dystopias. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this work. Yeah, eco-dystopias, eco-precarity.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. For some reason, that phrase has, the title has become extremely popular, and I get queries about it. It was coined, as somebody said about the British Empire, in a fit of absence of mind, but it seems to have gone every place. Eco-dystopias, in the kind of version that I can think of and have worked with, would be primarily the text I mentioned, Apupan's text. And eco-dystopia here is not an invasion narrative. I find that very interesting. I'm not looking at the outbreak and the invasion narrative as made standard in Hollywood. But in these graphic texts that I'm interested in, the eco-dystopia is a human creation. It's what we have done. So Apupan's Halala series shows excessive consumption, which in all dystopian texts is the key cause of everything going wrong. Our greed to consume more and more. And like I mentioned briefly, it concludes with the posthuman sense of the world. But I've also worked with and been interested in texts like Rachel Hope Allison's I Am Not a Plastic Bag, which is about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And there I looked at how trash evolves into a trash monster. And the trash monster with a face, it's traditionally called pareidolia, where you see faces in clouds and stones. So I worked with something called pareidolia reading, where the monster comes together and the visage will haunt us humans for a long time. And because the garbage patch, the plastic is so supreme, it's not an invasion from outer space. It is what we have created, which has invaded our world. And I created a portmanteau term. I called it the plastocene. Like all the Pleocenes and the other scenes in geological terms, a plastocene, which plays on the word scene as well, S-C-E-N-E, which gestures at both the geological and the fact of it being theater. And I thought it was a very interesting text because it's also wordless. I'm also thinking of texts like Nick Hayes' The Rime of the Modern Mariner, which reworks the Coleridge poem and it's a good text to talk about imminent eco-disaster. It repurposes a canonical text and communicates an ecological message. And the focus is on the endless wastes. The ocean has been transformed into waste, what I've called the decadent sublime, a sublimity of waste itself, entire oceans of waste. But like Apupan, Nick Hayes also returns us to a certain mythopoesis about the earth, about the human life on earth, about the interconnectedness of it. So it invokes Thor, myrmidons, and mythic creatures, all implying an older form of knowledge which we have ignored, and texts like that. But I'm also interested in, though I've not written on it, I mean, it's part of my eco-precarity book, Carl Pfeiffer's Chernobyl text, Radioactive Forever. I've not yet come to grips with this particular text, but the only graphic novel I know on Fukushima, ICHI-F, ICHI-F, is a massive text as well. And I think these texts are central to how the message of ecological disaster can be communicated. I think the value of the demotic form, which I said is useful to talk about social injustice or social inequality, is equally important for ecological messages.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Plasticine, I love that neologism. Tell me, Pramod, how do you bring this, your vision, your work, your research, comics, graphic novels, all of the stuff that you do into your classroom? And what is the Pramod kind of, trademark teaching method?
My students, some of whom will be online, will say several awful things, so it's better that they're on mute. I have actually never offered a full-fledged course on comics. That's the interesting thing. Graphic novels and comics have figured in the courses I teach. I've taught Bhimayana, I've taught Hush as part of a course on human rights and literature. I've taught it as part of postcolonial literatures. And this time I did a course on the new humanities, where some of these texts figured again. Carl Pfeiffer's Radioactive Forever figured in that. When we do that in the kind of classrooms we have, the focus is a lot on contents, I must say that, and not adequately enough on form, which is a bit of a deterrent. But there are actual logistical issues. You have to see that every student has a copy of it. It's not always possible for everyone to acquire expensive works. Say, for instance, if I want to teach graphic medicine, and the texts, they're very difficult to get hold of unless you're willing to pay. So we don't always have copies. So we make do. We'll not spell out all the methods by which we make texts available. So there's a lot of emphasis on contents, but we do try and do a little bit at least with form. For instance, we have looked at the use of ethnic art to tell the story of Ambedkar and the revolution he brought in. We'll look at the symbolism in Hush, the wordless picture book on child sexual abuse. And we have looked at how these forms engender a multimodal literacy. And that has been part of the discussion for a very long time. The use of the artwork and the symbolism. So in terms of form, there's been a considerable amount of insistence on looking at things like symbolism. But I suppose if one is going to do a full-fledged course on the graphic novel, we will do a variety of texts as well, from the more traditional panel gutter sequential art to wordless texts like, say, The Arrival or Hush.
Pramod, have you noticed, students being a little bit, I don't know, surprised that you have on your syllabus, graphic novels, comics?
Not in the university where I teach, which is a little more open about it. Like I said, it is gaining, shall we say, respectability across the country. I've had very senior faculty surprised, however, at the fact that I have comics on the syllabus. And when they've seen me reading comics, there was this expression on their face saying, "Is this what we pay you for?" I mean, how could you possibly be spending your time? And you should be reading Wordsworth. Well, I suppose, yes, Wordsworth, we'll say, has his moments. Not very often, but occasionally. But comics, but there have been moments of surprise, but increasingly students are asking for graphic text and comics, which I think is interesting. About maybe 5 to 8 years ago, it may not have been so popular, but it has more or less been mainstreamed into this. So I think that's an interesting one. We have had students. I had a student who worked on mouse a few years ago for her dissertation. There's somebody working on medical humanities who's looking at cancer across media, and graphic medicine is one of the forms being done. But in the syllabus, it has a rather uneasy location, I would think, alongside print, text, 400 pages, gritty social realism, or the postcolonial, and then there are these demotic forms. So I think it's an interesting blend, more challenging also.
Absolutely. So you kind of started talking about this earlier in our conversation, but where is the vitality, the heartbeat in comics in India today? And I know that you have the Delhi Comic Arts Festival.
Okay, I would think it's in the non-fictional work coming out of the publishing houses in India. That's where it would be, more than any other. So I would think the best work is coming out in the form of the partition volume, this side, that side, which was experimental in parts, the POW anthology of comics, the new series called Long Form, the non-fictional autobiographical memoir for work from Navayana, which has done the Ambedkar text, which has done the Jyotiba Phule text. These texts which work with the central socio-political concerns of Indian literature, but also Indian polity, Indian social order, and put them into this multimodal demotic form. That's where I think the best work is appearing, more than the fictionalized accounts that you occasionally encounter. I think this is where it is, really speaking. There's a key element in what you have termed the expansion of the planetary republic of comics.
Thank you. Yeah. Is there still a sense of, within comics at least, a kind of omnipresence of comics from outside of India? Or is India really like defining this space as its own?
Oh no, there is plenty of stuff coming from outside India into the Indian market. There is a version of DC Marvel which comes in Gotham Comics. There is a lot of exchange of this that happens, and it's also to do with the Hollywoodization of comics. Let's understand that the Marvel and the Marvel Cinematic Universe has a lot that it has contributed to the popularization of the comic books. So it's a very intertextual genre where the book speaks to the film and vice versa. And the hype around these films do generate an interest in the comic books as well. Whether it is the Michael Bay Transformers to the superhero Marvel Cinematic Universe. So there is a lot of foreign texts that come in. I know people who are extremely aware of, for example, web comics as well. I've not worked with those. I follow things like negative, positive, and the web comics there. But it's not something I've engaged with in any seriousness. But I know people who are very big fans of web comics.
Pramod, you have taken us on a journey. I know that you do so much in your research. It's really quite unbelievable how much you do publish, including your very important work on graphic novels and comics from India. I can't wait for your new book on this. And thank you so much, Pramod, for joining me today for discussion.
Thank you for having me over. It's been interesting to talk to. I like your work. And I think there's a lot of things that can be done and shared in terms of indigenous comics, but also comics from other traditions. My discovery of the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks being an example of what can be done. But yes, so thank you very much.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Lots of parallels that we can kind of learn from one another. Thank you, Pramod. And